Hi, I'm Mark Thorsby and welcome to History of Ancient Philosophy. In this video we'll be looking at an introduction to Aristotle. In particular, we'll be looking at Aristotle's categories in physics. So what I want to do today is I want to begin by giving you an overall general discussion of Aristotle's overall works, sometimes referred to as his organon, because it's a system of interlocking arguments, ultimately meant to capture a systematic um, it's a systematic approach to really all knowledge. And you're going to see that compared to Plato, Aristotle's breadth is magnificent. We're going to look at some key passages in the physics and the categories afterwards, looking at some of the specifics. Again, we are using readings in ancient Greek philosophy from Thales to Aristotle. So any quotations I have come from there, of course, you can always so if you're following along, you're welcome to do so. So first off, let me start off with a little bit about Aristotle's biography. He lived from 384 to 322 BC. He was actually born in a family. Now, he wasn't actually from Athens, although he's most famously associated with Athens. He was actually born in Stygia, as a Macedon. Now, his father was actually the doctor to Philip of Macedon, but his father, Aristotle's father, died when he was actually quite young. And when he was age 17, I believe it was Aristotle's uncle, took Aristotle to Athens to join Plato's academy at age 17. Now, in terms of sort of Hellenistic politics, Athens and the Greek states were captured by the Macedonians. So it's important to recognize that when Aristotle's presence in Athens is the presence that signifies that of an occupier. And so politically, there were a lot of people in Athens who didn't like Aristotle whatsoever because he represented an invading force, a non-Greek, Hellenistic force. Well, you might say they're Hellenistic, but they weren't Greeks. They were Athenian Greeks. Aristotle stayed at the academy for about 20 years, but he left after Plato died, and Plato's nephew was named the successor instead of Aristotle. So Aristotle actually moved to the island of Lesbos, where he met his first pupil and later his colleague Theophrastus. And Theophrastus is very important to the history of philosophy, but later on, because Aristotle was Macedonian, he would eventually have to flee Athens, but Theophrastus would stay behind and maintain the Lyceum, Aristotle's school he would found later. Now, in 343, Aristotle actually tutored Alexander, who would be Alexander of Macedon, who would later be known as Alexander the Great, at age 17. And in 335, Alexander was named regent and eventually emperor. Well, he was never an emperor technically, but he became the most powerful person in the known world at the time. And that's why he's known as Alexander the Great today. Aristotle returned to Athens at this point, and he founded the Lyceum. The Lyceum was actually a field outside of Athens, and he rented some buildings and started a school, actually. Now, the academy is still in Athens at this point, but part of Aristotle's goal here, and you'll see he has a different approach to knowledge, but part of his goal is to really bring together a systematic scientific approach to everything and make it and see what can be known about all things. So he wasn't just interested in philosophy, although you might say it's all philosophy to some degree, and I think he would say that. But for instance, they were studying botany. We know that Alexander the Great actually shipped botany samples back to Aristotle's school. Theophrastus was working in botany. Aristoxenus was working in music, identifying what we don't know, or at least I don't know, what the particulars of the work. But they were looking at history of mathematics, astronomy, physics, cosmology, psychology. In fact, one thing that's very well known and very famous, but unfortunately doesn't survive, is Aristotle collected 158 constitutions from all the surrounding Greek city-states because of his interest in politics. Unfortunately, I think there's a couple fragments left. but those do not survive, which unfortunately that would be like a political scientist's dream to be able to, see how the multiplicity of political forms of life that are possible. So, but of course, Aristotle himself writes. He also develops logic. He develops a study of physics. He develops a study of metaphysics, ethics, politics. It's actually grammar, poetry, rhetoric. Aristotle develops just this insane curriculum, and it's quite magnificent. But unfortunately, when Alexander the Great dies in 323, the Macedonian Empire actually segments into three different quadrants, but the power essentially begins to erode. And as a result, the Athenians are sort of up in arms, and Aristotle flees Athens because otherwise he would have been executed. It's well known, it's frequently said that Aristotle, on his way out of town, said that he wouldn't let the Athenians sin against philosophy a second time, of course, referring to Socrates. Of course, tragically, Aristotle only lives a year beyond this, living in isolation, and he sort of lamented. So it's sort of interesting, actually, because for those of you who've been watching the full series, or if you recall from our earlier video, Pythagoras also was forced to flee his own school, of course, in slightly more politically charged manner, but also died in exile. So it's interesting that Aristotle and Pythagoras share that similar sort of fate. So anyway, that's a little bit about their biography. Of course, you'll see that because Aristotle was the pupil of Plato, he knows very well the arguments. In fact, he knows them much better than probably we know them. But as a consequence, there's a lot of themes in Plato that Aristotle agrees with, but you'll see that they have quite distinct concepts at play. Now, one of the things you note is when you're reading Aristotle is his writing style is terse, it's dense, and it's difficult. Now, why do I mention this? Because unlike Plato, where we were reading dialogues, which are really meant for the public consumption, with Aristotle, who apparently did write in dialogues, and we're told, we actually have a couple of fragments of his dialogues, but we're told that by writers in antiquity that Aristotle was a beautiful writer, actually. Unfortunately, none of that survives. All of the good stuff is gone. I shouldn't say that, because what we are reading is pretty good stuff. But what survives are essentially what we probably consider to be his lecture notes, or even potentially the notes from his students that are maintained by the Lyceum after Aristotle's departure, or his exile. So that's sort of the first thing to note, is that they can be difficult to read. And part of it is because he's not systematically trying to explain any one subject. So he frequently references other things that other discussions he's had. And so as a consequence, when you're reading Aristotle, it becomes difficult because he'll refer to things and you don't know what he's referring to. And so you sort of have to know the whole to know the part, but you can't know the whole unless you know the part. And so you have this sort of odd paradox that I think takes place when one first begins to read Aristotle. But I can tell you that over the years, as I've been reading Aristotle actually over and over, I've seen that it's actually he's a remarkable writer, and he's quite direct, and actually I find it quite beautiful compared to Plato. In the sense that there's a precision that Aristotle's writing has that's magnificent. On the other hand, the complexity that's present in Aristotle's writing can be difficult. And also, I should say, to be on Plato's behalf, Plato's more systematic writings that we don't have were probably much similar to what we're reading in Aristotle too. So I don't want to take too much away from the master, as it were. But you'll see that in his general approach to his books, he generally will begin, just sort of the writing style, the genre, if you will. He'll generally begin by reviewing a subject's history and then sort of taking a look at what other people thought, figuring out where they went wrong, and then trying to keep as many received opinions as possible. The idea isn't to develop all knowledge all in one go by oneself. right? What's necessary in Aristotle's conception of science is that science develops over time through experience and through a multiplicity of uncoverings. And so he'll begin by looking and seeing what he can use from other people's perspectives. And then, of course, he'll then go into his own account. And that's sort of generally how the genre or the style that he has operates. Now, what I want to do next is, like I mentioned, you have this whole part problem in Aristotle. So hopefully to help you, before we talk about the physics and the categories in particular, I want to give you an overall treatment of the system at large, the general perspective here. Now, the first thing is that there's three different branches of science that Aristotle distinguishes. And by the way, there's so much written on Aristotle, and there's so much to say about Aristotle. I know that what I'm giving you here is ultimately insufficient in terms of understanding Aristotle, but hopefully this will give that context or frame for you. But there's three different branches of science, and the Greek term here is episteme, or episteme, and this refers to knowledge. So there's three branches of knowledge. You may see it translated. There's a theoretical, and theoretical knowledge is concerned with truth. So this is where we see, for instance, mathematics. There's practical science, or practical knowledge, which is concerned with human action, ethics and politics, if you will. And then there are the productive sciences, which are concerned with the making of things, fabrication. Hannah Arendt refers to this in her book, The Human Condition, as homo faber. We are a man that homo faber, meaning humans that fabricate, right? And so in Aristotle, there's productive sciences. And so you can imagine, for instance, we could talk all about these. A lot of your university sciences are theoretical, though there are practical ones. And then, for instance, there are productive sciences. You can think about technology, and maybe, for instance, a productive science would be something like perhaps computer science today. Now, but what is a science exactly? Now, there's lots to say here, and as we continue forward, I'm sure that your own thoughts here will become increasingly nuanced. But Aristotle begins by giving an explanation, right? And so the explanation here, I'll zoom in here, is that a science is an axiomatic system where first principles allow, that should be allow, my apologies, allow deductive inferences to the subject matter of the science. Oops, let me move it up here. There we go. So it's an axiomatic system where you begin with first principles, and then you can deduce the various elements or characteristics that are subject to that science. So, for instance, chemistry here, I guess in his view, would involve understanding the first principles of the chemicals themselves, and then from there distinguishing the necessary relations that follow, right? Now, science, he says, is demonstrative, right? And that means that science operates through demonstrative arguments that can demonstrate a particular point. So it's not opinion because it's demonstrative. The problem, or not really problem, but one of the things that Aristotle takes pains to point out is that the first principles themselves are non-demonstrable. I'm seeing lots of spelling errors, my apologies. But the first principles themselves are not demonstrable. So let's give an example of logic. Logic for him is the science of argumentation. It's the science of reasoning, right? One of the principles in logic, and I have a video on this, you can watch in the logic series, is the principle of non-contradiction. And the idea there is that something cannot both be and not be at the same time in the same way and in the same respect. That's what a contradiction is. And the law of non-contradiction says you can't contradict yourself. Because if you can contradict yourself, then that means that true premises cannot lead, well, I should revise this, but it would mean that, for instance, something can be true and false at the same time. If that's the case, well, number one, that's unintelligible. But if it were the case, it would mean that no arguments about things could ever produce knowledge. So the law of non-contradiction is the central sort of principle, or one of them, and Aristotle actually is the first person to sort of articulate it. But there's another one called the law of excluded middle. But the law of non-contradiction is so central to reasoning that logicians use it for a whole range of different things to look at. But the idea here is that non-contradiction then is the principle for doing logic. But non-contradiction as a principle cannot be demonstrated, right? Why? Because every demonstration requires the use of the law of non-contradiction. So, right, I can't demonstrate to you that it's reasonable to say that you can't both be in the room and not be in the room, right? I can't demonstrate the truth of that claim because any demonstration, if it's rational, depends upon it. So as a result, first principles are something that we grasp not through demonstrating arguments or through demonstrative reasoning, but first principles are grasped by the mind. Aristotle uses the term nous here, right? It's grasped by the intellect in some way. And this is an important sort of distinction. So we have a faculty of intellect in his view that can grasp the first principles, and those first principles operate as axioms, right, within the science. Now, each science has different principles they're using, and the goal of science is to figure out what those principles are. Because if you can figure out what those principles are, then you'll have universal knowledge about that subject, because it's always required. It's actually fairly interesting, and I hope this is making sense. But you will see that even though this is Aristotle's sort of explanation of what a science is, his method is quite the reverse, right? He actually utilizes an inductive procedure most of the time, in which he's not using deduction. Now, deduction is the idea of argumentation by necessity, right? Reasoning through necessity, what necessarily has to be the case. But a lot of what Aristotle does is he goes by probability, which is what we refer to as inductive reasoning. And the probability here is he'll use his experience a lot of times. He'll say, this is what people have said, this is what I've said, this is what I've been able to observe, etc. Take all of these experiences, and then from those experiences, he begins to move towards an evaluation of the first principles. Now, and he generally moves from a perception of particulars to the knowledge of the universals. And so his method seems distinctly different, and maybe even at odds with, though I don't think it necessarily is, with his explanation of what a science is. And so there's this interesting sort of tension in Aristotle's writings, consequently. Now, one of the key questions here is a unified theory possible, right? Is it possible to actually dutifully figure out all things that can be known in all of these different ways by articulating and finding all of these first principles? After all, isn't that what the modern university is today, right? Isn't it something like this, where we try to accumulate all of this knowledge? Now, but there's a slightly different question here, because Aristotle's task is not simply to catalog knowledge, quote unquote, but to actually develop a rational system for which those explanations have meaning that's consistent across the board, that is non-contradictory. And so a unified theory here would require a metaphysics. He has a book called The Metaphysics, very famous and very difficult, perhaps the most difficult book of his. Metaphysics studies first principles, that is, all of the individual sciences, botany versus logic versus literary criticism versus psychology, all of these sciences are trying to figure out what these principles are, but is there an overall master principle? And he argues that in a science which is about reality, that would mean that you have to study the first principles of all things. That's what the study of metaphysics is. And when you talk about the first principle of all things, we're talking about all things that have being. And so what we're really saying is that we're studying being qua being in its most general abstract view. We're studying the principles for being itself. That's what the study of metaphysics is about for him. You shouldn't think of metaphysics as a theory of some other reality that it typically, and maybe even Plato is badly characterized as sort of gesturing towards some other reality. I mean, Plato does talk about this, but I think it's more complicated than we tend to give Plato credit for. But when you think of metaphysics for him, he's not giving all these theories. It's a theory of this reality, of being as such, right? And he doesn't doubt his experience the way Plato seems to doubt his, right? So reality for him is made up of substances. Now, this term he uses here, substance, is ousia, and ousia literally just means being, right? So reality is made up of being, and there's lots of different beings. You can see there's books behind me; they have being. There's me; I have being. There's you; you have being. There's the computer; it has being. All of these are substances; they're beings. But there's an important distinction is that he makes between what he calls primary substances and secondary substances. Now, the primary substances are what I call the actual entities, right? They're the individuals. So this computer, right? So this coffee cup, etc., right? Those are the primary substances. They're the actual entities. But there are secondary substances, and these seem to be, Aristotle refers to as the terms and the categories we use to refer to the primary substances. So, for instance, the thisness of the cup is the primary substance, but the word cup refers to a secondary substance. So, because there's lots of different things called cups, right? Lots of different beings that Plato would say participate in cupness, right? And so these are secondary substances. A science, though, for Aristotle, is ultimately concerned with primary substance. So when we talk about being, we want to talk specifically about the thisness of the things we're talking about. So this is an important distinction. And it's important because you could probably ask yourself, for instance, you can look at a coffee cup or you can look at anything and you can sort of take it in for what it is. But then think how easily we just use names to refer to things without ever actually thinking about the things themselves. And that's for Aristotle to not recognize the primary or the secondary substance conversely. So there's this distinction here, which is really quite interesting. And I'll admit here, I probably have a Heideggerian take on this whole thing, if you're noticing some of my language. Now, for instance, I say, consider the difference between the chair in the front of you and the concept of a chair, right? Right. And when you say there is a chair in your room existing, there's a difference between our conception of it and the actual substance itself. Now, I don't think, this is not Aristotle's example, and I don't think that Aristotle would be completely comfortable with the example, but from a modernist perspective, it seems to me that this is the difference we're talking about between primary and secondary substances. Again, I'm not an Aristotelian scholar, and so I encourage you to continue your research, to see what the intricate debates that go into this. Now, substance. Every substance, every being, right, is composed intellectually or logically is distinct in terms of its form and its matter. Now, the way I think about this, and in my other video I talk about this, is matter is the stuff that separates us. It's what we're made of, right? It's what makes me separate from you. And the form, so matter is what something is made of. It's the stuff. And the form is literally the shape, in the case of my hand. The form doesn't always have to be a shape, but there is form. Right? It's made of stuff, but has a certain sort of shape. You can imagine if my hand turned into like a crazy, bear claw or something, right? It could be made of the same stuff, but then it would have different form. But if it changes form, then it's no longer the same substance. And the same thing goes if the matter changes, it can no longer be the same substance either. So every substance has both form and matter, but there's no such thing as matterless form, and there's no such thing as form without matter, right? They always exist simultaneously. So Aristotle's notion of form here is not the same as Plato's, where for Plato, the form represented a transcendental, perfect reality or ideal object. For him, form adheres within each subject in terms of its shape, literally. And so the primary substance is where the form ultimately is the primary substance. And it's not a physical, but it's not a physical theory. I want to put this in here because sometimes people can interpret Aristotle's notion of matter here as saying that everything has to be made up of some physical stuff, right? You can talk about form and matter in a whole variety of ways. Think about, for instance, Romeo and Juliet. That book, right, has a certain form, has a certain plot, and it's made up of certain things, matter. It has certain characters, for instance. So not every substance has to be physical. Not every being has to be physical, at least in the same way. But every being does have form and matter.